Welcome back to DRM News. Sudan, it seems like a place always caught in some kind of turmoil.
It's true.
Today, we're going to take a hard look at what's happening there.
Absolutely.
Your sources paint this really grim picture. Conflict, instability, a huge humanitarian crisis.
Right.
We need to unpack all of that, understand why it's happening, and grasp the human cost of this tragedy.
Yeah.
So we're going to look at the roots of the conflict, the major players, and the humanitarian consequences.
Okay.
And then we'll explore what the world, if anyone, is doing to address this crisis.
Let's dive in.
Well, maybe not dive in, given the heavy subject matter, but you know what I mean. Your sources highlight this stark contrast. There was all this global optimism when South Sudan became independent back in 2011.
It was a new nation. So much hope.
A new nation with the promise of freedom and democracy. Your sources really remind us of that initial energy.
Yes, a powerful reminder.
And it's heartbreaking to see how quickly that hope seems to have faded. Just 2 years later, South Sudan plunges into civil war.
Right.
The sources point to President Salva Kiir firing his vice president, Riek Machar, as the trigger.
Absolutely. That was the spark.
A nation barely born, and it's already consumed by internal conflict.
It's a recurring theme, sadly.
This constant challenge of ethnic divisions. Your sources emphasize that the main division in South Sudan is between Kiir's Dinka people and Machar's Newer community.
Exactly.
And tragically, both leaders have been accused of putting their own tribe's interests above the entire nation.
It's such a damaging dynamic.
One former official even said that Kiir has this preference for tribalism.
Oh, wow.
It really undermines any chance of building a united country.
Definitely.
The source also digs into Kiir's past. He was a rebel commander, right?
Under John Garang, yes.
He rose to power after Garang died in 2005, became president of South Sudan.
A very specific trajectory.
You have to wonder how those experiences shaped him.
You make a great point. It raises questions about those transitions from leading a rebellion to leading a diverse nation.
Like, are the skills even transferable?
Right. The challenges are immense, especially when it comes to overcoming deep-seated ethnic loyalties.
Like we see with this focus on tribalism, as your source highlighted, it becomes this critical weakness.
A weakness that can be exploited.
Okay, let's shift gears to Sudan itself. Your sources set the stage for the war that erupted in April 2023.
Between the military, led by General Abdel Fattah Burhan, and the paramilitary Rapid Support Forces, RSF, led by General Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo.
It's almost a story of betrayal, isn't it?
How so?
Well, these two were allies at first, united against a return to civilian rule.
Oh, right, after the 2019 uprising.
They joined forces to essentially block the democratic hopes of the Sudanese people.
A crucial point.
But then they have this falling out, this power struggle that explodes into violence.
It demonstrates how fragile these alliances of convenience can be.
When personal ambition takes over, it seems like anything goes.
Unfortunately, that often seems to be the case.
So, what's the situation on the ground right now? Your source suggests the suffering is immense.
It's truly staggering. Over 28,000 deaths have been reported, and that's likely a significant undercount.
Oh, wow.
Over 14 million people displaced, and parts of the country are on the brink of famine.
Just unimaginable. And what about control of Khartoum? The military claims to have taken back the Republican Palace.
That's correct.
A pretty symbolic victory, right?
Huge. Initially, even a politician linked to the RSF acknowledged they lost it.
Really?
Yeah, but then the RSF came out and said, no, our forces are still there, we're fighting.
So it's a very fluid situation.
Very fluid, hard to know for sure who controls what amidst the chaos.
But one of your sources suggests that even if the military wins in Khartoum, it might not end the war.
That's right.
They actually say Sudan could end up partitioned.
De facto partition, yes.
With the military controlling some areas and the RSF others, particularly in western Sudan and much of Darfur.
And don't forget, the RSF still controls Khartoum International Airport.
Right, since the start of the war. So that gives them a strategic advantage.
Absolutely. It strengthens their position significantly.
This potential division sounds like it would have huge consequences for the region.
Oh, without a doubt, it could create even more instability and tension.
And your sources point out that even within the military's coalition, there are potential cracks.
Yes, it's not this unified force with a common vision.
It's a bunch of different armed factions, each with their own history and rivalries.
That's a good way to put it.
So this alliance against the RSF could easily fracture even further.
It's an impossibility.
Okay. Now, the humanitarian catastrophe. One of your sources describes a visit to a makeshift hospital in Chad filled with refugees from Sudan.
Heartbreaking.
The descriptions are just haunting.
The silence of those children suffering from acute malnutrition, they're too weak to even cry.
Oh my God.
It's gut-wrenching. And the source gives these very specific examples, like a 6-month-old baby the size of a newborn.
Awful.
And another child with swollen ankles and blistered skin.
Such vivid, horrible images.
It really brings home the brutal reality of what's happening.
And it's even more disturbing because of the parallels to the Darfur genocide 20 years ago.
Under Omar al-Bashir, yes.
The source makes this point that it feels like history is tragically repeating itself.
And despite that, the international response has been shamefully inadequate.
We have this recognition that Sudan is facing one of the worst humanitarian crises in the world, but the aid just hasn't followed.
It's a terrible failure.
18 million people facing acute hunger, famine looming, almost 8 million displaced from their homes.
Those numbers are lives, you know.
And it's not just food, it's the spread of preventable diseases like measles and cholera in these terrible conditions.
Right, compounding the existing problems.
It's just horrific. And to make things worse, your sources say both sides are blocking aid.
It's infuriating.
The Sudanese armed forces are preventing aid from crossing from Chad into Darfur.
And the RSF has been looting humanitarian warehouses.
Adding to the misery they've already created.
Exactly. It shows a complete disregard for human life.
The UN Security Council did call for a ceasefire back in March.
Right.
But your sources say it's just not enough.
Empty words in the face of such brutality.
They argue there's been no real enforcement, no follow-through.
And on top of that, the World Food Program warns they might have to cut food aid for Sudanese refugees in Chad.
Why?
Lack of funding.
Seriously.
Only a tiny fraction of the UN's humanitarian appeal has been met.
So what can the international community do? What about holding people accountable for these atrocities?
First and foremost, world leaders need to demand that all the warring parties respect international law and allow humanitarian access.
A strong, unified message.
With real consequences if they don't comply.
One of your sources suggests the Security Council could authorize aid to be sent directly into Sudan from neighboring countries.
Like Chad and South Sudan, similar to what they're doing in Syria.
Right, bypassing the blockades.
It could be a vital step.
They also call for the UN to appoint a senior humanitarian official based outside Sudan.
Whose job would be to push for access, scale up relief efforts, and really get donors on board.
Because the current funding situation is just not sustainable.
Not even close.
And then there's the whole issue of a justice for the crimes being committed. Your sources highlight the Biden administration's warnings about the human rights abuses.
Right.
And Secretary of State Blinken has already determined that both sides have committed war crimes.
With the RSF and their allied militias specifically being accused of crimes against humanity and ethnic cleansing.
Incredibly serious accusations.
Absolutely.
So the U.S. has imposed sanctions on some of the militia leaders.
Targeting those responsible for abuses, including sexual violence and ethnic killings.
A step in the right direction.
But is it enough?
That's the question. And then there's this recent UN report detailing the horrors being committed by the RSF.
Gruesome findings.
The rapes of women and girls, some as young as 14, the sniper attacks on civilians, the burning of villages, massacres.
Over 1,000 Masalit and other non-Arab minorities were reportedly slaughtered in Ardamada, West Darfur.
It's just overwhelming.
This level of brutality demands accountability.
Full support for the International Criminal Court's investigation, documentation efforts, everything possible to bring those responsible to justice.
There can be no impunity.
Looking ahead, what are the possible paths forward? This seems like such a complex, entrenched situation.
The most urgent need is to stop the fighting and get Sudan back on a path towards democracy.
But how?
Well, one big obstacle, according to your sources, is the role of regional powers supplying weapons.
They're fueling the conflict.
And enabling the atrocities.
And your sources are very clear. These arms transfers violate the UN armed embargo. They need to stop immediately.
There's no other way.
It's also clear that this conflict won't be solved militarily.
Right.
The only solution is negotiation.
A negotiated settlement.
But that requires everyone involved to shift their thinking, be willing to compromise.
And that's where the African Union, leaders in East Africa and the Persian Gulf, can play a critical role.
They have the influence to push the warring parties towards peace talks.
Exactly.
The Biden administration seems committed to a diplomatic solution as well. They've appointed Tom Perriello as the U.S. Special Envoy to Sudan.
A positive sign.
And they're working to prevent Sudan from breaking apart.
Which would be disastrous for the entire region.
Absolutely. Your sources also stress the importance of working with grassroots leaders in Sudan.
To build momentum for a civilian, democratically elected government.
Because ultimately, lasting peace has to come from within.
It does.
And one of the most powerful messages in your sources comes directly from the people of Sudan.
What do they say?
They feel abandoned by the world.
It's heartbreaking.
They're suffering unimaginable horrors, and they feel like no one is listening.
Because the silence is deafening.
That's the phrase one of your sources used, and it's so true.
We, the global community, cannot ignore their pleas any longer.
Your sources lay out the truth. Political failures, ethnic tensions, a humanitarian crisis spiraling out of control. It demands a unified, powerful response.
Absolutely.
We need to break the silence. The silence of those children too weak to cry. The silence of the world that's turned its back on Sudan.
It's time to act.
We hope this deep dive has given you a clearer understanding of the complexities of this crisis.
And why it matters to all of us.
What will it take for the world to finally hear the cries of Sudan? What will it take to ensure justice and lasting peace?
Those are the questions we need to keep asking.
Thank you for listening.